Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Martin Puchner discussing his latest book, Literature for a Changing Planet, in conversation with Wai Chee Dimock. Tonight's event is part of our ongoing virtual event series. As we remain digital for the time being, we're so excited to continue the work of bringing authors and their writing to our ever-expanding community during these difficult times. For tonight's event, we will conclude with some time for your questions. If you would like to ask the speakers something, locate the Q&A function wherever it may live on your Zoom display, where you can submit all your questions. We will get through as many as time allows. If you go to the chat section, I will shortly be posting a link to our website where you can purchase your own copy of Literature for a Changing Planet. If you already have a copy of the book or would like to contribute to our series and our store in a different way, I will also be posting in the chat a link to our website's donation function. We greatly appreciate any and all support you are able to extend to us this time. Please note that closed captioning is available for this broadcast. Depending on which version of Zoom you are using, you may need to enable it yourself by simply locating the button marked Live Transcript on your display and clicking through all the options. And one final note, as you have no doubt experienced during virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If any glitches do occur, we will do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Martin Puchner is the Byron and Anita Wien Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Harvard University. A prize-winning author, educator, and public speaker, his previous books include The Language of Thieves, My Family's Obsession with a Secret Code the Nazis Tried to Eliminate, and The Written World, The Power of Stories to Shape People, History, Civilization. Tonight, he is joined in conversation by Wai Chee Dimock, William Lamson Professor Emeritus of American Studies in English at Yale University, and the author of Weak Planet, Literature and Assisted Survival. Now a researcher at the Harvard University Center for the Environment, Professor Dimock's essays have appeared in a variety of publications, including Art Forum, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the New York Times, and the New Yorker. Tonight, Martin and Wai Chee have joined us for discussion of Martin's latest book, Literature for a Changing Planet, a millennia-spanning voyage through world literature and its ever-shifting climate, which Matthew Bell, professor of German and comparative literature at King's College London, calls a bravura performance, part manifesto, part work of advocacy, and part history. In prose that has been called powerful, lucid, and eloquent, Puchner reveals world literature in a new light, as an archive of environmental exploitation and a product of a way of life responsible for climate change. For those of us who continue to engross ourselves in books, even as the world around us becomes more and more sick, Literature for a Changing Planet is an essential reminder that stories are one of the most important tools we have in the fight against global climate change. We are so excited to be hosting this event tonight. Without further ado, I'm delighted to turn things over to tonight's speaker. Martin, the digital podium is all yours.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. Thank you all for being here, for tuning in. And thank you, Wai Chee, so much for talking with me about this book. I've learned a lot from Wai Chee in writing this book. So it's a real pleasure to be talking to you in a moment. We thought I would start us off with just a little bit of to give you a sense of the book. And I'll do that with with a few slides, so you have something to look at. And so the first thing I want to say about this book, it's a short book, and it's in a way a kind of a distillation of the kind of work in world literature I've been doing for the past 15 years or so, work that really got me going. The work that really got me going on this path was editing the Norton Anthology of World Literature, which I started doing about 15 years ago, and which was just kind of an eye-opening, really mind-blowing experience, because I realized I thought I was relatively well-read in world literature before I started this editorial work, and quickly realized that was not the case, and just discovered an incredible amount of literature, and really also a sense of the scope and depth of the 4,000 years of literature. And so that's been occupying me ever since, in part because I realized that we in literary studies are often very narrow in our specializations. Not everybody. Wai Chee is a notable exception. And that's great for many things, but it also precludes us, or it at least precluded me from actually asking and potentially answering some of the most fundamental questions about literature, including when was writing invented? How often was writing invented? What is the shape of literary history? How did new writing technologies change storytelling? And how did storytelling interact with oral literature? And so in the work on this anthology and afterwards, in collaboration with many people, I started to try to sort of piece together that bigger picture of literature, starting with the earliest literatures, the Epic of Gilgamesh, written 4,000 years ago, but also thinking about different independent literary traditions. And for me, the Mayan writing tradition became very important. It's the only completely independent literary tradition in the world. I thought a lot about epics and oral storytelling, including the Mali epic Sunjata, which is not known enough. I started to think about different major genres of world literature besides these epics. I just mentioned story collections like the Panchatantra and the 1001 Nights, as well as non-fictional genres that clearly had a huge influence on world history, including the Communist Manifesto. And I tried to sort of put together that bigger picture in a book that came out a couple of years ago that Benjamin mentioned, The Written World, The Power of Stories to Shape People, History, and Civilization. And so what I did now, what I did in the new book, is essentially take that bigger picture of storytelling and apply it to climate change. And the reason for it is really in some sense a very simple one, or it's a very simple premise, and that's we are storytelling animals, that stories are a very fundamental way in which we humans understand the world and our role within it, our position within it. Stories are hugely important for motivating action or inaction. And so that this is something really important for climate change. And it's a way in which the humanities have something really important to contribute to climate change. So this kind of conviction had formed in my mind, and I'm by no means the only person to have that conviction, I think. I'm sure I'm sort of preaching to the choir here, but that that conviction then, when I think about climate change, or when I started to think about climate change through that lens, made me realize that there's something that we in the humanities can do better than we have hitherto done. And it's the following, that I think there are a lot of people who pay attention to climate fiction. There's this whole literary field of eco-criticism. I think especially recent novels with climate change topics have received quite a bit of attention. And that makes a lot of sense. But if we try to understand why we are where we are, what kind of deep motivating stories have brought us to the moment where we are, where we clearly are engaged in a lifestyle that's unsustainable, I think it's not enough to just look at contemporary literature. If we are looking for these fundamental stories, we can go back to the entire canon of world literature, and to understand where these fundamental stories come from. And so this is the first part of the book, essentially, that then leads to this formulation: how to read the canon of world literature. And I try to present a kind of protocol or method of reading. And just to give you a very small taste of that, one story I start with is indeed the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of course, the oldest stories, the first long text in world literature. And it makes sense to look at it from the perspective of climate change, because it is also the earliest text in which the story of the flood is articulated. that later finds its way into the Hebrew Bible and hence the Old Testament, and is become one of the paradigmatic ways in which we think about catastrophic natural change. So it's interesting that the story of the flood told in the Epic of Gilgamesh is actually different from the one in the Hebrew Bible, in that in the Hebrew Bible, it's a story of sin. Humans have sinned against God and therefore are being punished. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, even though the details are the same, the motivation is different, and it's also the gods that bring about the flood, but it's more kind of population control. So it comes with much less of a moral imperative, which is interesting. But the main motivation for looking at this text or using it as an exemplar is actually not even the story of the flood, which is just an interpolated tale in the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's its main story. The main story and the context of the main story, because the Epic of Gilgamesh is a story about urban civilization. It's set in Uruk, one of the first cities in the world. Gilgamesh is a city builder, and is very proud of the city. The epic starts by giving us a tour of the city, almost like a city tour, and that's how it ends. And so the first major plot involves Gilgamesh and a new creature whom the gods create called Enkidu, who lives with the animals and is a kind of wildling. Even though he's created as a human, he's not yet fully seen as human because he lives with animals, he eats raw food, and has to be literally seduced by a human woman into the city to become fully human, to start eating cooked food rather than raw food, and to associate with other humans. So now we have our sort of buddy movie in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the major adventure these two friends undertake is to slay the monster Humbaba. So it's a classic monster story. It's a classic aspect of epic literature. And we don't really even have to read between the lines. We just have to read the epic very carefully, and it becomes clear very quickly why the monster Humbaba has to be killed. And that's as soon as this monster is dead, the monster guards a forest, and as soon as the monster is dead, they start a logging expedition and bring back timber. Why? Because you need timber in order to build cities for doors and roofs. And so that becomes that's basically what happens, that the slaying of the monster is sort of a facade behind which a resource extraction happens, because Mesopotamia has been going through this urban revolution, and which has led to deforestation. And so city builders like Gilgamesh have to go further and further afield to get timber, in this case, many hundreds of miles to what is now Lebanon. So this is really an example then of how resource extraction, urban civilization, and written literature really in some sense go hand in hand, something that gets confirmed through this line drawn between urban civilization and wilderness. People who live in the wilderness, like Enkidu initially, aren't even fully human. So this is sort of an example of how very deep stories about civilization and resource extraction are laid down in world literature 4,000 years ago. And so I go through this kind of reading through some of these other core texts for me of world literature that I have mentioned, such as the Popol Vuh and the Epic of Sunjata and many others. So that's essentially the first half of the book, is to look where these deep stories about humans and urbanism and wilderness and resource extraction come from, and to identify them and understand how they've been floating through different waves of civilization for about 4,000 years, which is pretty amazing, and makes it realize what, in some sense, we are up against. We're not just up against, a carbonized economy or a particular form of industrialization. I think, in some sense, we are up against something much, much deeper. And I think this deep view of world literature, in some sense, helps understand that. So how to read the canon of world literature for the purposes of climate change. This is what the first half of the book tries to do. The second half basically then says, what so now that we understand that, what should we do? What stories should we actually tell? And there, I feel like the discipline of literary criticism that is going in some sense through this, kind of crisis right now, actually has a lot to contribute. It can give us a good sense of what different story types there are that are currently being used to tell stories about the environment, but also perhaps story types that aren't being used that would be very useful. So some of the major story types right now are overcoming monsters, as in the Epic of Gilgamesh, or it's sort of the genie out of the bottle type that, we have let loose this urban, extractive economy. What should we do with it? Or conflict with God, the flood stories as punishment, or the current favorite of Hollywood, apocalyptic disaster movies like Don't Look Up, the most recent one. So those are some of the stories that have been used, but maybe there are other types of stories that we should use. And so I'm making some sort of very pragmatic suggestions about that. But it's not just story types. It's also the question of who has agency in these stories. And there too, I think a kind of literary criticism has a lot of interesting things to say about agency. Now, one standard form of agency is the hero with 1,000 faces, and Joseph Campbell's approach, as some of you or many of you know, has been very, very influential in Hollywood. But that's not the only kind of agency we have, even though many disaster movies, including Don't Look Up, the most recent one, of course, focuses on a single or two protagonists or three protagonists who are going to save the world. It's very clear to me, however, that what we need is something much more collective. We need collective agents. So where do we find stories about collective agents? It's a little harder to find, but for me, one paradigmatic case, a text that I already mentioned, is the Communist Manifesto. Not because I think communism will save us here, but because this text managed to really create a new collective historical agent, and namely the proletariat, and create it, bring it into consciousness, in some sense launch it. And I think that's partly the force of this text. So here's something that we in some sense can learn, or at least draw some inspiration from, when it comes to thinking about where do we find powerful texts that create or think about collective agents. And finally, I think it's equally important to think about collective acts of storytelling, because unlike the Communist League in London in 1847, we're not going to delegate one or two people to write the story of the future for us. I think it's clear that we have to think about collective acts of storytelling. And here again, the deep view of world literature provides some interesting models, or potential models, or at least, again, sources of inspiration. And one of them for me is story collections like the Panchatantra, or the 1001 Nights, or the many other story collections that are floating around world literature, and that really basically bundle and frame many individual acts, often anonymous acts of storytelling. And here too, this is something I think that we can learn something from. So these are basically the two parts of the book. First, the reading of world literature to understand where some of these fundamental stories that have been defining different forms of world civilizations for the last 4,000 years come from, for us to understand what we're up against. And then in the second part, in some sense, if you will, solutions, or at least ways of thinking about the kinds of storytelling we may want to engage in. And that's the second part of the book. And that's where I want to stop my little survey. And I'd love to, for Wai Chee, to turn on your microphone and camera, and dialogue with you. Thank you again so much for coming today, for being such an inspiration for the book. Wai Chee, your microphone is still muted.
Okay, so now you can hear me, right? That was great. That was so great. I mean, that's such a clear and ambitious, account of what you're trying to do. I mean, because in fact, most environmental humanities tend to focus on texts that are coming out right now. So nobody really has gone back, to the entire, Western and non-Western traditions, and look at the ways in which those texts really are about climate change, or maybe they're the prelude to climate change. But, I think that your book is really the first. So, I'm just really happy to be able to talk about that along those lines. But, you don't just talk about ancient texts either, because in fact, when it comes to, deforestation, for instance, you talk about Richard Powell's The Overstory, right? So I'm just really curious to know what you think, because in fact, the characters in The Overstory are the Humbaba, the modern day Humbabas, because they're the forest guardians, right? So there's really major transformation of the forest. I mean, although, I mean, in the Overstory, I mean, because they actually, the law is after them, right? They're actually criminals. So in one sense, they remain kind of, Humbaba figures, at least from the point of view of the law, but from the point of view of the novel, they certainly are not. So, I was wondering if you wanted to talk about, that kind of transformation, that this is a measure of the point where we are. I mean, and the fact that The Overstory won the Pulitzer Prize, I mean, it definitely is a mainstream novel. It's not some fringe kind of endeavor.
Yeah, wow, Wai Chee, that's such a brilliant reading. I'm not doing that reading in the book, to see the characters in Overstory as sort of modern day Humbabas. That's really great. I love that. I love that. And so, it's so interesting. Of course, I think we are going through a really interesting phase in contemporary climate fiction, if we want to talk about that, where I think people have realized, writers have realized that that we need to develop new strategies for, and I think The Overstory is a great example of how to narrate science, how to connect science to activism, how to create, sort of imagine to describe something as incredibly complex as a forest, or in other texts, mushrooms, and this kind of really focusing on the non-human world in various ways, whether animals or plants or interactions or whole ecosystems. And in some sense, I think the novel is actually a great genre for it, because it's good with complexity to some extent. And I think someone like The Overstory it is really a kind of a counter Gilgamesh, or though, as you say, they are in a way outlaw guardians of the forest. I think that's really brilliant. Yeah.
Oh, no, I mean, you're the one who put that book into your book. So I mean, you're definitely pointing the way. I do have a question. I mean, why is it the novel? I mean, it doesn't have to be the novel, right? I mean, because when it comes to literature, I mean, because certainly the Communist Manifesto is not a novel. So there are other kind of current books about forests. They're kind of very personal. But they're definitely nonfiction. So like Suzanne Simard's Looking for the Mother Tree, which is which to me it seems like a wonderful book, that can be read in conjunction with in fact, I think The Overstory is based on her, Patricia, the woman, is
the
based
scientist.
on her.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So, but her book is partly about herself, and the kind of the things that she learned by in order to learn about learn about trees, she has to learn a whole lot of other stuff, but also come to terms with the fact that, that she had cancer. So, I mean, so in some sense, it's a very Gilgamesh kind of book because it is about mortality and about how that is a kind of a constant background noise. I mean, that both, I mean, I'll talk about climate change. It's also about kind of collective mortality, but in her case, it is just an individual mortality that is in the foreground. But I mean, it just seems so. Those things are so tangled together, and so I mean, would you consider next time you do a book called? I mean, the next installment of this, would you consider looking at a book like that?
No, absolutely. And I think that you've made such a great case just now. And it's so true about nonfiction. I mean, in some sense, at least in the US, it all starts with Silent Spring, which is a nonfiction book, or, you can go back to Walden, which is a nonfiction book. I mean, sort of this, the observation, the whole science book genre, of course, is very, very important as well. There are, of course, also, as you know, I have worked in drama and theater, and there are attempts, and there are interesting people who are trying to write plays, climate plays. I mean, there's much less. I collaborate with someone called Gloria Benedict, who is a dancer who is very engaged in dance and climate change. I mean, that's not something that the dance world as a whole has really done very much. Her name is, I can type it in the chat, Gloria Benedict. She has turned sometimes science papers into dance pieces. So there are other genres are in some sense waking up to this challenge too. And as we know, all genres are good at certain things and not as good at others. And in some sense, I think that we need a kind of total mobilization. We need all of them.
Yeah. I mean, but you're not uncritical of literature either, right? I mean, in fact, I think that I was really struck by how emphatic you are that all these books are really part of an extractive economy. It's not just Gilgamesh, but, all of them, but they're for settled life against the forest, against the wilderness.
Yeah.
And that maybe literature as a genre, is kind of aligned, has a vision of human life that is not necessarily aligned with the well-being of the planet, and that seems to yeah.
Yeah, no, and it's true. And I don't just want to engage in acts of, I don't know, hate reading, it's sometimes called. I just don't want to dismiss it all. I think that literature is also a really important resource for helping us think through storytelling climate change the way we are doing with Gilgamesh right now, and seeing echoes, in the overstory as a kind of rewriting. So it's not that I want to say, oh, this is all bad, we need to get rid of it and then sort of start new. But I think it's certainly recognizing complicity, recognizing that the body of literature is one way in which stories get mobilized. And that's not always, sometimes it's the wrong stories. And I think we should be clear about that. But it's also a resource for thinking about, for telling us about storytelling, for allowing us to rewrite stories, as I think we are. So it's a complex operation, and but very influential. This is something that became very clear to me when I was writing The Written World. When you write about the texts that really change history, in some sense, you think like, oh, that's great, literature is so important, but at the same time you realize, well, the influence was not always for the better. So it's this complicated, and especially something with climate change, where we suddenly are forced to look at the world in different ways. And and somehow wrap our minds around this challenge, I think it makes sense that we couldn't just, find some important old text and saying, oh, that's the solution. I mean, that in a way that would be very strange and surprising. So it requires this struggle with and against in a way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, because definitely literature is not going to offer any solution, right? I mean, that's just really clear. There are no recipes emerging from this text that can guide us anywhere. But they're nonetheless extremely useful, right? So I was wondering if you can say a little bit more why, they're not good field guides, they're not good recipes or anything, they're not solutions in themselves, but nonetheless they're indispensable. So, what is that space that allows them to be indispensable?
Yeah, well, maybe should I put this? Well, as I said, it's a way of really understanding where fundamental ways of thinking come from and sort of identifying them. And I think the assumption is once you do that, you can work through it in a much more deliberate manner, and you can pinpoint, okay, here we've taken a wrong turn, or here is this, as with the Humbaba, we have to rethink Humbaba, not the monster, but the guardian of the forest. And so how can we do that? It's a powerful figure. It's maybe a figure that's been rewritten. We can gives us something to work with, perhaps, but to work with differently from, let's say, the Epic of Gilgamesh has done. So it gives us material. It gives us also, in the second part, perhaps strategies for doing that, because there's so much we can learn from literature. And again, especially I think if we take this kind of bigger picture view about different genres, different strategies, different ways of mobilizing, let's say, heroes or collective agents or collective arts of story, there's a lot to be learned.
Yeah, I have two questions. One is going back to the kind of the very long time frame that you have, for thinking about literature for a changing planet. This extremely long time frame is sort of counterintuitive would be counterintuitive in one sense, in that most people think that, all this started with the Industrial Revolution, right? But you are suggesting that in fact it goes back much farther than that. That the Industrial Revolution is really the kind of the latest, the most recent, example of an extractive relation to nature. That it really goes back much further than that. And that seems to me to be really bold. It's sort of like, there's a new book that just came out by David Graeber called The Dawn.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So I was wondering if you see yourself in that way, that it really is from the very beginning. It's the story of humankind from the beginning, and has always been bound up with some kind of relation to the planet. Yeah.
No, David Graeber, very powerful. I have not read the book, though I want to. I read his previous one, The History of Dead. It seems to me, judging from the reviews, that he, in a way, he's doing something similar, but also different in that he wants to take the story that somehow, in his case, injustice and oppression somehow went hand in hand with urban civilization and division of labor and intensive agriculture and so on and so forth. And he wants to take the inevitability out of that. And I think is looking for alternative forms of intensive agriculture that led to different forms of social relations. So I think to point toward, and he's always has an activist and present agenda, so that we don't have to feel like we have to throw all of this overboard and start fresh or something like that, that there are actually alternative ways in which this was configured. It didn't always lead to pyramids and slave labor. And so I think that's very interesting. And I suppose you could say that what I'm trying to, I mean, it's a much smaller book in a much smaller terrain in the stories. I mean, it's large enough, but that I'm trying to do something similar in that I'm showing the way in which literature is often complicit with hierarchies and in this case extractive economies, but also that it doesn't have to be that way, that there are ways in which we can bend these stories or mine these stories. Oh, that's an extractive metaphor, I think. Nevertheless, mine these stories for alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I'm just thinking that you and Graeber have the same kind of impulse, of just going much further back. Yeah, I think that's
right.
It's a basic parallel between your book and his. I mean, I haven't read either. I mean, I've read little chunks. I haven't read it from cover to color.
Yeah,
but
your own work, Wai Chee, you after all are the person who coined in literary criticism this term deep history and deep reading and deep time. And so I think that your work has really been, and there are so few people who do that. You were really one of the pioneers of that.
Well, I mean, but not so much in relation to climate change. I mean, I was thinking of just as a matter of reading. But I think that even though climate change is not centrally, in the foreground for Graeber, I think that in many ways it is about the world as it now stands because of climate change. But he does have kind of indigenous critique, right? He all through the book, he points to various indigenous practices as really viable alternative practices at the point when they were first practiced, and especially viable now. So, I mean, I wonder, I mean, the indigenous element is I guess something that I would love to see more of in your work. I mean, just because it goes so well with, with practices, with the non-human and just alternative practices.
And also, no, I totally agree. And also the sense that the record of written stories is so partial, and that to get a sense of oral storytelling is something that's become more and more important for me in my thinking about literature and its limits. We are in the process right now of doing a new edition of the Norton Anthology of World Literature, and we are really trying to build in indigenous storytelling much more than it's been done in other anthologies. So I totally agree. It's very important.
Yeah, I mean the other thing that I just want to bring up is I think for most people, climate change. I mean, the most important thing is decarbonization, right? But your book doesn't really address that in any kind of frontal way. And instead, you really, I mean, you think about extraction, but I mean, fossil fuel is a kind of extraction, so it's a part of that economy as well. But again, that the farming itself is extractive, and that seems to me to be a very broad-based argument that I mean, it seems to go back to the critique that maybe Marshall Sahlins made, about Stone Age economics, about how that the beginning of the fall of humankind is the beginning of agriculture.
Yes.
And so I'm just wondering, whether you would define your target in that particular way.
Well, I think that doing the big picture thing, I think that comes with advantages. You see things that you don't otherwise see, but of course you also then have to zoom in and think about different forms of extraction. Absolutely. And logging expeditions and deforestation is one thing. A carbon economy is another. And certainly when it comes to technological solutions, it can make a huge difference. So I think that as always, you you have to kind of both zoom in and out. In this book, I zoom out more and zoom in only in a few very sort of exemplary ways. But I certainly don't think that that's the only way of doing it. And I think zooming in on very particular economic relations, whether that's, for example, also particular extractive colonial relations and so on and so forth, is very important. And there's I think very good work on that. Wai Chee, I see that there are quite a few questions, and we have only less than 20 minutes left. Okay. I wonder whether we should invite Benjamin and some questions, and the questions might be, I think you'll be able to answer some of the questions better than I do, so I think that we can both try to answer some of these.
Let's hear the question. I'd love to hear the questions.
Sure. So on that note, I'll start with this one. Someone was clearly very interested in both of your readings of Humbaba. So this is a great question. So someone asked, are there any other particular enemy characters in any of the old stories besides Humbaba that you would like to see get a contemporary climate rewrite?
Yeah. So the other figure I talk a little bit about is Polyphemus in the Odyssey, who it's really interesting because we see the Cyclops through the lens of Odysseus. He's the narrator of this particular episode, and he initially describes the Cyclops as these people without organization, without even any form of solidarity or community, these individual people who live by the grace of Zeus and who don't have agriculture and anything. But then when you read the episode very closely, you realize that that Polyphemus, the monster Polyphemus, who doesn't work, and they don't work, and so on and so on. It's like there's this whole sort of set of prejudices that Odysseus mobilizes. And then in the story he himself tells, you realize that you see Polyphemus caring for his sheep, making cheese. He has all these different baskets. When Odysseus blinds him, he calls for help, and the other Cyclops come and help. So clearly there's a very clear sense of community. So this is another episode that I sort of read again a little bit against the grain, but you don't have to do it even that. You can do it very, very quickly, and you realize that there's something. So whenever anything has to do with agriculture is one way of saying this. It's worth really paying attention to how it works. I feel like there was a part of this question I didn't answer.
Sorry, going back into the
just
question.
a makeover of a Well, I'll quickly add something. Another character that I like to see a makeover for, which is Cersei. I mean, you didn't talk about her.
Yes.
I think that she's fascinating because she turns humans into pigs, right? So she's really emphasizing this kinship between, we can be human for 1 minute and the next minute with something else, and
that's good. That's good.
Kinship between humans and humans. So in that sense, she's very ecological minded, and it definitely, she's thinking of humans as not, it's no big deal to be humans. You can just get turned into something else, and non-humans might turn out to be the primary life forms on Earth. So we all end up being non-human. I think it's just
that's
really,
good. That's great. I love that. Yeah.
Novels about her, so I'm not the first to think that.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. The other portion of the question, Martin, was I think you did sort of answer it. It was about seeing a contemporary rewrite of a figure.
Yeah.
Which I guess Cersei does provide Madeline Miller's Cersei is a very good example of her sort of in an ecological standpoint.
Yeah. And this just, now I remember what I wanted to add just very briefly, that in general, I think this question of the enemy, or I forget how the question phrased it, or like the monster or the enemy. I think that in our climate fiction today, there is a clear sense of certain roles of the enemy, the oil company, the merchants of doubt, and so on and so forth. There's a very developed discourse about victims, the victims of climate change, the whole discourse on climate justice. There is sort of a discourse about sort of quixotic individuals who are trying to fight against these overpowering forces, and so on and so forth. So I think it would be very interesting actually to, again, from using the resources of literary criticism and to think about these types of stories, victim stories, monster stories, a quixotic story, like these. I feel like there are 3, 4, 5 figures essentially that get mobilized in contemporary climate fiction. And this is not a critique. I think these can be powerful stories to pinpoint an enemy, to describe victims, and so on and so forth. But sometimes I almost feel like we have a relatively small repertoire of these figures, and maybe, and anyway, to think more systematically, intentionally about these figures. Is this the only way to tell stories about the climate? Are there other figures we could mobilize? So anyway, the sense of the enemy, because the enemy is a very strong figure in climate fiction, and maybe rightly so.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, enemies can also be aliens, right? So, I think the sci-fi featuring aliens, which is, the entire genre, can be really powerful vehicles to thinking about climate change. There's actually, there's a novel by Ursula Le Guin called The Wood for World is Forest. And it features the aliens there are supposedly backward people. There's the whole, it's an intergalactic world. So there's just one planet or something. I think it's a planet that the inhabitants are very backward, and they're all full of forests, and they speak a different language, but they also enemies. They actually sabotaging the protagonist's side. So this is, in that way, this is really interesting kind of uncertainty about, when you call somebody the enemy, maybe what you're revealing is that in a deeper sense, you're an enemy of somebody else, right? It takes two to have enemies. So it's just really kind of instability of where the guilt of blame lies.
And I see that Al Daly rightly points out that and I totally agree that one problem with identifying the one enemy versus the victim and so on and so forth really goes against some form of collective storytelling, some collective action, collective responsibility that I think is important. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that answer. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. So someone says, I am so thrilled you brought in Scheherazade. The story of a woman specifically telling stories in order to prolong her life feels very topical. Could you talk a little bit more about how you envision collective storytelling as a means of survival?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. It is about surviving, and it's about surviving, and it is also about education, because so it's true. In a literal sense, it's from cliffhanger to cliffhanger, and Scheherazade mobilizes all the storytelling to survive. That's so right. It's interesting that in some of the framing stories, they actually reveal why she knows all these stories, that she's not just making them up, but that she had access to a library. And that's where she, which is, since we're talking about books and literature and so on and so forth, which is very interesting, that she's this reader who then uses what she's read for a survival. But it's also the case that by the end of the cycle, she has, in a sense, if you will, cured the king, because the king is mad. He is in this murderous rage against women. He's really, and the kingdom is about to break down because of this king. And this is why Scheherazade decides to intervene, offer herself as his next victim, but then changes gear, becomes a storyteller. And it's interesting that many stories in the 1001 Nights are about infidelity and infidelity and who you can trust. And you feel like through these stories, Scheherazade is actually re-educating the king, so that by the end, he has kind of made his peace with this world in which sometimes infidelity happens and it's not the end of the world, and so on and so forth. And many of these other stories, the Panchatantra that I mentioned, is also it's a mirror for princes. It's an educational tool. So I think that's where my thinking about these story collections comes from, because there are these many different individual stories that get collected, also from all over the world. Some of the stories from 1001 Nights are from India, some from Greece, of course there's the Persian model. So it's this kind of multicultural story collection that gets framed by Scheherazade in this incredible way, and sort of through this frame story focused on certain topics such as good kings and bad kings and misogyny and a pedagogical project. And that's sort of in the back of my mind when I think about, well, this is actually this may be something to think about for our own purposes. Yeah. So thank you very much for that question, Wai Chee.
And I think that, definitely, I mean, storytelling in its core is educational. I completely agree. I think that in our time, though, I mean, it doesn't have to be, the stories don't have to be collected in books, right? Or even any kind of, formal medium. It can also just be, I think that a lot of climate scientists actually want to get personal stories from people who, who are sort of on the ground, they're the on-site witnesses, and then they can actually demonstrate a lot of things about what climate is doing to individual locales, just because they are there, that's the home. And I think that those stories really have a lot of already now, and it really gives a whole different dimension to storytelling when, the scientists can use satellites, to look at climate change, and then, those stories are fine. The data is fine, but you really need more personal stories to bring that data home down to earth. And so I think that this is, I completely agree with you that there's special urgency about and efficacy about storytelling at this moment.
Thank you so much. So moving on to this next question. So the person writes, several books written today not only reckon with the damage of climate change, but also imagine a world after the destruction. The mushroom at the end of the world leaps to mind. Is reading about catastrophe in world literature also useful in terms of imagining possible, even regenerative aftermaths?
No, of course. I mean, and that's maybe, we talked earlier, Wai Chee, about fiction versus nonfiction, and you rightly pointed out, and just now again, that nonfiction stories are really crucial, though this kind of post-apocalyptic imagination, and one can think of Margaret Atwood among many other examples, I think is an important mode. Wai Chee, I wonder what your thoughts are on
yeah,
that.
I mean, Margaret Atwood is a really interesting case. I mean, I think that she's definitely, I mean, for her, it's not just not just a dead end. There's always something afterwards. But I think the person who's who's unusually optimistic about climate change is he's not. I don't think that his work is ever reviewed in the New York Times or any mainstream media. But he's a respected sci-fi writer, Kim Stanley Robinson.
Yes.
And I mean, because he always manages to imagine what happens after the catastrophe, and it actually is kind of a livable world. You just have to make all kinds of adjustments, but you seem to be able to do it. So I mean, that's a really interesting version of thinking about what happens, 100 years from now, where we definitely have to make adjustments. I mean, we have to do it in less than 100 years. So I think that Kim Stanley Robinson's vision of, I mean, is a world that we just have to deal with. And the fact that we have to deal with it means that we will. And so that's really, I don't see a lot of other people writing in that vein. So I think that he really stands out in that way.
He does. And of course, why does he stand out that way? Because he studied literary criticism and literary theory.
And Jameson. Yes. He was a student of Jameson at UCSD. So there you go.
Great. So I'm going to jump in with, I think, with what will probably be our last question, unfortunately. And I'll read it in its entirety because Chu Tong in the audience has given us a great question. So thanks so much for the great talk. I have a question about orientation in and through texts. I wonder whether it is the current situation of climate change that drives you to rediscover classical texts of world literature, or whether it is through the rereading of these classical texts that makes you further reflect upon climate change and environmental humanities.
And would it be great if you could more thoughts on the relation between text and the world? Is that question?
Yes.
Yeah. No, and the relation between text and the world, I mean, that it's so well put, this question. I agree. And I think the reason why I think it's important to reread these texts is because I think there is an important relation between these texts and the world. And I would say there's a sort of almost like a feedback loop, because I mentioned the Epic of Gilgamesh, and when you read it, you really get a sense of the environment of this world, the city that's being built, the food that is being brought from the outside, the clay from which the city is built. You really get a sense in this epic of the environment that's created, also the artificial environment. This is the beginning of urbanism in urban literature. So there's that relationship. Let's just say the world reflected in these texts, and you can read these texts in order to get a sense of these environments. But then, this is what I try to do in the written world, is to really think about how texts, especially influential texts, transform the world, because sometimes they get used for fragments of the Epic of Gilgamesh have been found all over the Near East, which shows that this was really a text that was exported, that was in some sense partially driving one of the first territorial empires. Again, this is a very ambivalent, it's not just, oh, rah, that's so great, but that influence, to show that these forms of storytelling really transform history, I think is the other thing. So that's how I think these are two just very basic ways of thinking about the text and the world, as Edward Said put it, but both sort of understanding the way in which they shape each other, and there's a kind of feedback loop in some sense.
That's incredible. Well, thank you, Martin. Before I end things for the evening, any last words for our audience?
Well, I just want to thank everyone. These are great, and I see a bunch of other great questions here that I'm sorry I can't answer. Feel free to email me. My email is very easy to find if I haven't been able to answer your questions. And Wai Chee, thank you so much for your thoughts. I feel like I now want to start to immediately rewrite the book based on this conversation.
Definitely to be continued. So there'll be more.
And thank you, Benjamin, and thank you, Harvard Bookstore. Great. It's been great to see in the pandemic Harvard Bookstore surviving, and I don't know whether thriving is the right word, but through these online events, reaching people way beyond Cambridge, which has been wonderful to see. So thank you, Benjamin.
And again, thank both of you for this fantastic conversation. It was so very, very wonderful. Thanks to all of you out there for spending part of your evening with us. Please learn more about this incredible book and purchase Literature for a Changing Planet at harvard.com. I put the link in the chat a couple times to purchase. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, enjoy the rest of your week. Keep reading and stay safe, everyone. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Yes. Have a good night, everyone.